Superintendent Johnson has served as the superintendent of IPS, Indiana's largest public school district, since 2019, and is the first Black woman to lead in this role. Superintendent began as a middle school teacher. She's been an educator for 19 years. She's achieved success as a teacher, a school leader, and administrator in both public charter schools and traditional district schools. She's a native of Evansville, Indiana, and the superintendent and her husband, Andre, have 4 wonderful children, 3 of whom attend IPS. Thanks so much, Superintendent Johnson, for being here. Next, we have Dave Hersh. Dave Hersh leads Proving Ground, which is at Harvard University's Center for Education Policy Research and an evidence-based continuous improvement initiative, and he's been there since 2019. Before that, Dave was the CFO of Camden City School District in New Jersey and a strategic data project data fellow. And last, we have Carl Allen. Carl is co-founder and president of Formative Technologies. Prior to starting Formative, Carl was the COO and CFO at Harvest Network Schools in Minneapolis. He was also previously the vice president at TransDev, a multimodal transportation operator, and importantly, director of transportation for Boston Public Schools. So let me quickly frame up our discussion today. I think, as many of us know, COVID has been a seismic shift and really brought into stark focus some of the equity gaps that existed prior to the pandemic, particularly as it related to serving some of our most vulnerable kids. And so many of us are thinking about, given what folks like Superintendent Johnson and other districts have done to really pivot on a dime and think about how to better deliver education, technology, food, a variety of significant services to kids. Is there an opportunity now, as we think about the resources that stimulus afford us, as we think about this idea, and I'll steal from the current president, as we think about this idea of building back better, is there really an opportunity to rebuild our institutions with a focus on students at the center, and really use some of the learning of that pivot and that need for durable, more nimble infrastructure to kind of really meet the moment. And so as we think about this work, strategic transportation, we think is a key part of that learner-centric future. And so that's the backdrop for this conversation. Where does transportation fit in? How do we think about that as one of a series of things that can really ensure equity and equitable access, particularly for our most vulnerable students, so that it's not a barrier to a high-quality education? So that brings us to our panelists. And so I want to jump in and bring Dave Hersh in. Dave, would love to get your thoughts on what you're seeing in the field right now, and also would love to know where this panel finds you today. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, physically, the panel finds me in Philadelphia, but it also finds me sort of in a moment of sort of very cautious hope, because we have a unique opportunity to finally do things that I think a lot of us recognize and a lot of educators recognize were necessary long before the pandemic. But I think the pandemic is finally sort of bringing forward this combination of this really acute recognition of need with a remarkable sort of once in a lifetime opportunity with resources. So a few of the things we're seeing are, like I was saying, this recognition that business as usual is not really an option. And I think everybody kind of always had that sense. But what we're seeing in our partners especially is this broader recognition that we need to reform our institutions to be much more dynamic and responsive, right? One of the challenges of this pandemic was just how quickly education institutions had to pivot to serve students, and how poorly set up they were to do that. And so it took sort of this amazing heroic effort from educators to get us where we are today, with students actually being in a position to learn. But it shouldn't take a heroic effort, right? Our institutions should be built to be responsive to the inevitable shocks that are going to take place over time. And part of being dynamic responsive is having a much better evidence infrastructure, right? How do you know what you need and then know the ways to serve those needs? And that's all about evidence. And so we're seeing this much greater recognition in the role of evidence in building this dynamic and responsive infrastructure. Likewise, we're seeing a really exciting recognition of a pivot towards user-centered design, right? We've heard sort of stakeholder engagement as a priority a lot. And I don't think we've fully sort of lived up to the goal of really engaging stakeholders, but I actually think we've realized, this moment has made us realize that we need to go a little further. And it's not just engaging stakeholders, it's actually making them the center of the design of the very institutions that exist to support them. And so, so this recognition of user-centered design, I think, is a really exciting thing. And then, of course, just like folks are sort of trying to digest a one-time infusion of funds, or I guess a three-time infusion of stimulus funds that nobody really had prepared for, and that we're not normally set up to digest this much money and use it well. And so folks are sort of scrambling for any guidance, any advice on how to use that well. And so our take on this is bring all these things together, right? These actually fit really nicely. And so the foundation of the educational system, sort of these institutions, should be built on an infrastructure of evidence and an infrastructure that leverages the users in the generation, interpretation, and allocation, or use of that evidence in the allocation of resources. And so we think this is actually what stimulus should be spent on, right? The stimulus is one-time funding. Your greatest return on investment is in infrastructure, and this is what the infrastructure should be. Therefore, this is what we should be spending stimulus funds on. And so I think there's an animation. Yeah, there's the next click. So my hope is that that funding, spending on the infrastructure, makes the institutions more dynamic. Really quick, what we mean by an improvement infrastructure highlights just how well transportation fits this mold, and why transportation is such a good case study in how this can work. So a good improvement infrastructure means educators, the people designing for students, understand the root causes of the problems they're trying to address. In the transportation case, right, we do a lot of work on attendance. Transportation always comes up. But simply saying transportation isn't good enough doesn't get us that far. You need to understand the roots of the limitations, the barriers that transportation is creating. You need to be able to identify actual solutions. It's one thing to know the roots. It's another thing altogether to actually have a set of solutions that you can use to address those roots. And again, in the transportation field, we all know we have one solution. It's a big yellow bus, usually run and organized by an existing entity that's been around forever and doesn't have the same incentives as the people that it's designed to serve. Engaging students and families in that process. There is no more user-centered need than transportation, right? Thinking about who the driver of the bus is, who the kids on the bus are going to be, whether it's a bus at all of that should be really designed around the user. And I know Superintendent Johnson and Carl are going to talk about that. You should also be trying things out. Transportation is a massive investment. Making all of your investment in one shot is a recipe for having no idea if it works and potentially wasting a large amount of resources. And then, of course, once you've generated the evidence, you should be deciding based on it. So that's sort of our vision for how to use these resources. And I'm going to turn it over to Superintendent Johnson to talk about how Indianapolis is actually bringing this to life.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of the conversation. Lots of what you were sharing is resonating with me as some of the work we've been doing here recently in response to COVID, but even before COVID-19 hit, some work we were doing in our transportation efforts. And so this slide kind of outlines the challenges we were facing. One, our yellow bus costs were extremely high. And so when we looked at and analyzed our spend against similarly sized urban districts, we were anywhere between 1 to 5 to 2 times higher in our spend than what you would find in a district our size, which means if the dollars are going toward yellow bus services, they're not going toward our classrooms and teaching and learning in ways in which we could support our students more robustly. So that was one goal that we were working to attain. And the second was a lot of getting to that, accomplishing that goal would be through being more efficient. So very thankful to have Carl and the formative team as partners in the district, because we highlighted and realized there were lots of opportunities for us to be more efficient and to break out of, as Dave talked about, kind of this is the way it's always been done and we're just going to do it that way because we don't really know a different way. So there were a lot of opportunities. So there are a few things that we have done. One, as a result of COVID last year, when we were trying to figure out how to actually maximize and leverage our buses and our routes more efficiently and serve the most students, we then had to flip that to the opposite problem of like, how do we get kids off of school buses from a health and safety standpoint going into this school year? We had our board had a walk zone policy in place since the late 90s, but over time, the system hadn't really enforced and executed on that policy consistently. So you can imagine a squeaky wheel scenario whereby I'm a parent, I call, I need an accommodation, I have a pretty good reason for it, we make it, and it just stays in place year over year over year because we weren't doing a great job, again, of sort of auditing ourselves in those decisions. So that policy over time had not been enforced consistently. We also had started about 3 years ago, a pilot with our public transit system, Indigo, and offered all of our high school students at no charge a bus pass, a universal bus pass they could use 24/7, 365 for their transport needs, including coming to school, extracurricular activities, going to a job, with our thinking being there's probably the opportunity for us to transition some of our students over to the public transit system and remove from yellow bus, and in fact, probably increase the quality of their transport to and from school each day. And again, expand their access to our city and our community. And so we actually moved, after 2 years of piloting that, we'll be moving our first group of high school students to Indigo as their primary transit to and from school starting next school year officially. So we'll have about 600 students who will make that transition in year one. And then, and I'll get out of my depth range, so Carl could probably talk better about this than I can, but as it relates to transportation efficiency with our yellow buses, opportunities to have less stops, which increases efficiency, increases or shortens the amount of time it takes to get our students to school each day, pairing our routes more efficiently, all of that stuff, which, you know, again, are just not easy wins, but a lot of the things we can do if we organize ourselves better on the back end to then free up those resources to allocate those in different places inside the system. And then finally, as it relates to our students who qualify for McKinney-Vento because they are homeless or experiencing housing instability, and our special education students, some of the systems we could put in place there. So back to this idea of sort of legacy, and always done it that way. We know we have obligations to our students who receive special education services to ensure they have transportation, we are meeting that bar. But again, we did not have strong processes in place to make sure we were auditing and ensuring that actually was the best sort of system and support, and a needed support for our students and families. So building in for ourselves the system of auditing that so we can be sure, again, we are shifting where we need to shift and making sure we're meeting the needs of our students and families. So what that will allow us to do, really getting clear and figuring out the opportunities for efficiencies, is to sort of tighten up what that traditional transportation system looks like, so that we can then think about, well, now how do we actually leverage transportation in more strategic ways? So you can see on the slide, there are a few things that we are now thinking about and tackling. The first is our stability initiative. So we have, like many districts, parts of our district that have schools with really high student mobility. And the way that our system works in IPS, we have some schools that are called choice schools, meaning we'll transport you to those choice schools anywhere in the district, doesn't matter where you live. But then we have our regular sort of traditional neighborhood boundary schools. And if you move out of that boundary, you don't get guaranteed transportation, and now you need to move to a different school. Well, from an academic standpoint, we know that kind of mobility negatively impacts our students' ability to be able to achieve what they would if they're having their learning experience disrupted so frequently. So one of the things we're thinking about, particularly with ESSER, is how do we, as we're thinking about learning acceleration and stability, leverage transportation in ways to help us do that. We can't change our entire system over this next few months and get that done, but we do believe there are ways in which we can stabilize parts of our system that'll create a more solid foundation for our students and families as it relates to learning. We're also thinking about, again, our McKinney-Vento students in ways that we make transportation decisions for them on the front end, so that even as they become housing stable or have additional shifts and changes, we've already thought about that on the front end, so they're not having constant disruption in their transportation. And then for our students who want to make different choices and or are engaged in our career technology education, a lot of our kids with our post-secondary focus, we are building in work-based learning opportunities for them. They're getting internships, and transportation is often a barrier for them. And it does not make fiscal sense for us to put 1 or 2 kids on a big yellow bus and send them to their internship site. And so how do we think about, again, this sort of diversity of mobility options for our students, that they can take advantage of those opportunities. We can support them in doing that in a way that's fiscally responsible, but again, nimble and flexible to the needs that they have. So those are a few of the ways in which we're really trying to think about transportation as a means that will help us support our students in a variety of different ways.
Awesome, Superintendent, such great stuff there. I know lots of excitement to dig in further on some of those great topics. Maybe I'll give it to Carl to share a little bit more from the formative perspective here, and then we'll move from there to Q&A, just given some of the great threads of conversation that folks have raised so far. Carl, over to you.
Thanks, Rajeev, and thank you, Superintendent Johnson. Really great to hear some of the fruits of our work and the exciting work that we've been doing with you guys, to hear some more about that. I think this is an exciting moment for formative. I just want to give a little bit of an introduction to us and what we do. We are a transportation technology management and consulting company that kind of came together around this new idea about a new way of doing education mobility. One of the key things that we recognized was that districts in their vendors have partners with misaligned incentives, right? So that vendors are typically incentivized to run things less efficiently and aren't helping districts think about what a transformation to a kind of new mobility ecosystem can look like. And our vision is that, just like what Superintendent Johnson said, is that we can start to minimize the burden, minimize the costs, minimize the kind of fixed liability of transportation, and transform it into something that can be leveraged to expand learning opportunities and leverage strategically. Our approach is kind of holistic, partly because of our diverse backgrounds. And we come about it with a focus rooted in education and in educational outcomes and what you're trying to accomplish with transportation. So, myself included, I'm trained as an engineer and an urban planner, actually had been a classroom teacher, and also worked with Boston Public Schools in the Office of Accountability. So approached transportation with those lenses and those tools. And that's part of the approach that we're taking, and what I think is really the new way. And there's this exciting opportunity now, I think, to take more aggressive steps towards that kind of way of operating. So as Dave had mentioned that kind of the old way was, you had a big yellow bus or you didn't, and that's what transportation meant. But we want to start moving towards a vision that's sustainable and that's also multimodal. Districts are typically locked in a kind of a compliance orientation. That is to say, we just, whatever the cost, whatever the method, we have to provide this service, rather than thinking about how is the service meeting the needs in the most efficient way of our students. Is it student-centric? What's the user experience like? Are our structures very rigid, or are they adaptable in future? And again, COVID has exacerbated this, but we recognize that we need this transportation system to be able to adapt. And so what we need to do is move away from high fixed cost, find a way to minimize those fixed costs with efficiencies, right? Such that we can, again, not move past this binary service paradigm of you either have it or you don't, but how do we rather differentiate the services we're providing in a targeted way to create equitable access? So there's a number of levers that you have at your disposal, and these are some of the things that Superintendent Johnson talked about, but these are the kinds of things that you can start to leverage stimulus funds in order to start moving towards this new education, adaptable, sustainable education ecosystem. I just want to comment on a couple. So quickly, moving to walking or leveraging public transit are great kind of potential quick wins, but also you need to be very strategic and thoughtful about how you approach that, ensuring that, and this was part of the work that we did with Indianapolis, was ensuring that there's equitable access. You don't just flip a switch and put students on public transit when you don't understand the service levels that they're likely to experience. So you need to understand what their journeys are going to be like. And if you can provide an equitable experience with public transit in some places or with some schools, for example, or some parts of your city or your district, then that can be a good alternative to yellow bus and a cost savings for the district. Also provides other benefits. The idea of thinking about your matching supply with demand, one lever on the supply side is just to bring in more drivers, right? One of the problems that we have, and again, another thing exacerbated by COVID, is our driver shortages. Well, so recruiting may be part of the solution, but also thinking strategically about, in your context, what are the barriers for drivers and candidates getting through the process? Where might you be able to use alternative supply or non-CDL drivers, so sort of bypass those some of those pathways that can be a little bit harder and more expensive and take longer. The idea of stop consolidation, as Superintendent Johnson pointed out, is one of those levers there. You really have to be cognizant of this trade-off between the efficiency you're trying to create and what it grants you in terms of the shorter routes, the saved costs. But it's also a conversation with families that you're asking more of them, right? You're asking them to walk farther to bus stops, and so that's a really important and thoughtful conversation that needs to be had. Finally, on the kind of vendor vehicle mix point, there's opportunities to diversify supply that makes you more resilient, gives you more options when there are driver shortages with one particular vendor or mode type, or you have adaptive needs, you have new needs that come up, that you have a different mix of vendors and vehicles that you can deploy. Electrification of your fleet is an example of a new kind of vehicle mix that is an exciting opportunity to leverage new funds for. But again, an approach that it needs to be taken very thoughtfully with respect to the operational implications of moving to electrification, not just the financing challenges. So again, a lot of opportunities right now to start moving towards these systems, but sometimes the first step needs to be deeper analysis. Sometimes you can jump right into redesign, and sometimes there may be in your context great opportunities to move right into implementing some of these things, leveraging new funds. And this critical point is this reset of expectations that has occurred with families during this time, that there's an opportunity to kind of restart the conversation. And what does it mean to provide transportation, instead of getting them out of that mindset that transportation is I get a yellow bus or I don't. Districts thinking about how I provide mobility supports to families in a variety of ways to remove the access barriers in a targeted way.
Awesome. Great stuff. Thanks so much, Superintendent Carl and Dave. Would love to kind of build from there. Such great comments from all the panelists. And maybe I'll kick it off with a question that kind of builds on what Carl was asking. And it speaks a little bit to how to get started on this work. Superintendent, obviously lots of priorities moving pre-COVID, and then obviously during the pandemic, et cetera. How did you think about kind of how to activate this work? Kind of what level of the organization? How did this bubble up as a priority? Clearly, it's sort of connected in a way that you think about the learning opportunities for kids. Just interested in sort of how did that unfold in the IPS scenario?
Sure. Well, I think to Carl's point around analysis, we had started doing some of that work pre-COVID because we knew we had this out of whack spending. And we wanted to be able to leverage those dollars in a different way. And so we had started that process of just thinking about what are some of the shifts we could make, and had done some of that over time. We had shifted our tiers. We had, what else have we done? We moved to a new provider. There were some of those things we'd done over time to try to get at reducing the costs. I think what COVID did, and this is a little bit to Dave's point, is sort of hit on, hey, we actually need to be able to pivot, and we need to be able to pivot quickly, and really provided for me, particularly as a leader, this proof point that like we actually can. So yes, we're big and we're bureaucratic and all of those things, but like that doesn't mean we cannot pivot and shift. We can do that. COVID forced us to do that, and now we know we can. So we don't really have a reason to, you know, sort of stay in this "it's the way we've always done it" mindset. That can just be very easy to take on. So I think we were accelerated in our thinking about this because of the fact that we'd had to make those pivots so quickly, you know, with the level of intentionality and strategy. We were also just dealing with the fiscal reality of needing to make sure that we were reducing our spend. And when it came down to it for me, I was not willing to look first at classrooms and schools and staffing. It was like, where do we have some operational opportunities to get to these reductions that won't negatively impact the teaching and learning experience for our kids? And so that was absolutely a priority. And then the last thing I'll say, particularly on the transition for public transit, that's, you know, obviously a huge deal. And we are in Indianapolis, so we're not like a city known for a, you know, robust public transit system. And so that's a culture shift for a number of our families. Because we had started the pilot a couple of years earlier, we had students and families who could talk about what that transition had been like for them, the access they now had to the city that they didn't have before. We could make the point that, hey, the way the system works right now, if you miss your yellow bus, there's not another one coming and you just missed that day of learning, versus public transit would allow you, you might be late to school, you can still get to school. And we were able to work with our public transit partners to talk about things like safety, reliability, and those kinds of things. But because we had started that work a couple of years ago, we were able to sort of execute on a larger transition coming out of this time of COVID. But to the point around using the time we are in right now to do that reset and recalibration while folks are already in that mindset, I would just say start.
Yeah.
Get started.
That's great. Sort of building on that, for any of the panelists, maybe Carl, you can kick us off. Exactly to this point in terms of how that reset starts and how you talk to families and engage families in this process. Carl, what have you learned from your work, you know, in Boston and beyond, in terms of how to have that conversation with families and community about those trade-offs and what the opportunities are as it relates to this kind of multimodal shift you're talking about?
Yeah, I think this is where, you know, super important that you've done the work to be thoughtful about, you know, before you're proposing something, for example, like this pilot group that Superintendent Johnson talked about in Indianapolis. That was a very specifically tailored group based on the journey times that we predicted for those students given where they lived. So what you're offering them is something that you can say plausibly and defensively, this is commiserate with the yellow bus journey, right? So and that has other benefits. I think talking to them honestly about the trade-offs that, for example, if you're stop consolidation or you're limiting service across one dimension, you're telling them that what about tightening a constraint or a system feature over here? What is that going to allow over here? What other kinds of flexibilities and benefits is that going to offer? Whether it's, you know, resources back into the classroom that might be a little bit more fuzzy for folks to understand, but to clearly say with respect to, you know, we're going to ask you to walk a little bit farther to a bus stop, but we can guarantee more reliable on-time service. Your bus ride is going to be shorter, right? And this savings in transportation is going to allow us to offer new late bus services or new kinds of more flexible transportation services to connect, you know, expand the learning opportunities that you'll have access to. So I think being clear about what those trade-offs are so that families know that, you know, they're part of this and you necessarily may ask something of them, but what's in it for them too. They need to understand that.
Great. Interested to hear from folks, particularly on the funding model side. And Dave, maybe you can kick us off in terms of anything you're seeing around braided funding across multiple funding streams. Obviously, we have this big infusion of stimulus dollars, but any thoughts as it relates to connecting a variety of funding sources? Kind of, are you seeing geographies or others think about bringing those things, bringing those different sources together in a way that can really maximize what we're talking about here in terms of these transportation opportunities?
Sure, Raj, I wish I could say I am seeing that. And full disclosure, a lot of our work doesn't get us a ton into the weeds of this with our partners. So a lot of this is sort of peripheral knowledge that I have because I'm a nerd and I'm still interested in the financing side of things. But one of the sort of disturbing things we're seeing is as folks try to digest all this funding, a sort of lack of understanding about how it can be used and what it can be combined with. And so the sort of big focus we always have whenever we're sort of advising people on this kind of thing is you should combine your funds to the extent necessary to serve current needs without putting yourself in a terrible position in the future, right? And so what you don't want to do is take 50% of your stimulus funds, throw it into your transportation budget right now, and then hope that in 3 years when those stimulus funds run out, you're going to find that extra 50% somewhere else. And so what you really want to do is combine it to the extent necessary to invest in the future, but your baseline funding should always be designed to cover your future needs so that you're not relying on funding that won't always be there for your future needs. And the nice thing about the way the stimulus is set up is there's a really nice long runway, especially with the third stimulus, and that offers a lot of opportunity to do this. And so in the pure sense, you'd have stimulus for investment, everything else for baseline costs, but you can actually merge those now, right? Like you have a little bit of a runway. And so you can a little bit top up your current sort of, if you're a little short right now, you can top up right now because you do have until with the amendment, 24-25 to finish spending your third very, very large stimulus package. And so while the general guidance is combine, but really focus stimulus on investment while the existing funding or recurring funding covers your baseline costs. What we'd say is you want to kind of merge those two. And so you can use a little bit of your stimulus to cover baseline costs as long as you're trending to run into a time where you no longer need that stimulus funding by 24-25.
Superintendent, would love your thoughts on this front in terms of how you're thinking about this in the Indianapolis context, particularly with some of the different streams that Dave's mentioning.
Yeah, I think his point around leveraging ESSER is spot on. So I talked about our stability initiative that we are designing around right now, and the goal would be to leverage ESSER in the short term to cover that particular initiative to help students be able to stay at their school and not be disrupted. But we know 3 years from now, we also have a body of work we're doing around our facilities planning and those kinds of things that we anticipate will like nicely dovetail with when we would need to make that transition into that initiative getting woven into our general operating budget. So we're not taking that on without having thought about 3 years from now, what does that mean? And in fact, we're trying to be very thoughtful about even the framing of this initiative as a particular effort to support student learning acceleration. I would anticipate once we get to the end of this time that framing might need to shift somewhat, whether this is just a part of how we do business now in the district, or if we need to shift some of that work, we'll need to frame it for that reality that we're in. So that's one specific example of how we're thinking about frame, funding, and then the runway that we have.
That's great, and it sounds like that braiding together has to happen in kind of what the goal is and what the student outcome goal is, and then you're building back across these dimensions. That makes a ton of sense. In terms of a little bit of a tactical question on that, where does that live in your organization? Sort of how have you thought about the folks around the table in the district that are leading that for you, or with you as you set that charge? Because I think one of the questions that folks ask is how do we start this? What level of the organization does this need to live at when you're tackling some of these bigger challenges?
Yeah, and are you talking about that particular initiative or just sort of our transportation, some of the transitions?
That particular initiative, and then also transportation.
Yeah, so for that particular initiative, our enrollment director is at the table because we needed the data, right, to figure out which schools and which areas of the district see the highest mobility. So actually it started, and he actually sits in our portfolio team. So it started with him getting that data and actually offering up to us, like, here are particular areas of the district where schools experience higher mobility. And then that conversation with our transportation team to say, okay, like if we modeled area 1, area 2, area 3, area 4, how many students will we potentially be impacting? Carl's actually doing some work to help us on this too. Like, what would be the cost then if we assume all of those students would make some transition and we're now going to keep them at their same school? And then the conversation with our chief schools officer around, so what would that mean then practically for schools and how they're supporting students and families. So those were the folks who were in that initial round of the conversation as it relates to that initiative. As it relates to the transportation particularly, and I see a question in the chat around our public transit transition, all kinds of folks around the table in that work. So again, starting with our operations team of saying, like, here's how we can make this pivot. Obviously, our school officer was engaged. Our family and community engagement team has been crucial. So we started talking about this. I mean, we started the pilot, a few years ago, but really started to talk about making this transition over to public transit for that group of students in January. And our family and community engagement team has been absolutely critical in that work alongside our transportation team to ensure that we had a two-way loop of questions and concerns we were getting from families. They had a school-based point person who could then lift those questions to us. We had a dedicated district email address and phone number folks could call if they had questions or concerns. We did a lot of internal conversations with our principals because we know at the end of the day, families want to hear from the folks who they see and talk to every day about this and trust the most. That's their school team. So they needed to be equipped to have conversations and know where to go for information. And so we did a lot of work with our family community engagement team, with transportation sort of in the background, feeding them that information that they needed to be able to give accurate answers to questions. The question in the chat was around safety. Did our families have apprehensions? That was absolutely the #1 common theme we heard in every single conversation was around safety. Because obviously, I can tell you you're going to have a shorter ride, which is true. I can tell you that it'll likely be more smooth, which is true. But it's also true that it won't just be high school students on that bus anymore. It's a public transit, and so others can be on the bus. So we worked with our public transit partner. They came and presented to our board. They were on every single town hall we had, with their safety director talking through in pretty explicit detail about the measures they have in place for safety and security, which was super helpful for families to be able to hear about. And then we tried to do as best of a job we could as acknowledging that we know this is a concern. We know this is a place you're going to have questions. Here's what we can tell you on the front end. And we can also commit to you that this is going to be an ongoing and continuing conversation. Here's how many rides our students have taken, over 100,000 rides, with, I think we had maybe 3 sort of instances that we had to have some additional support from the public transit team. So we were able to provide that data. We were able to have students come and talk about it. So there was a lot of work we did to address those questions of safety, but absolutely that was the #1 concern that we heard.
And if I may too, from speaking to this initiative, Superintendent Johnson, and then also speaking to my own efforts in Boston Public Schools back now almost 10 years ago, when we were working to transition more middle school students to the MBTA as compared to yellow buses. And I think safety is a really rich topic where, similarly to just kind of how you accomplish the mobility goals or how you leverage your system to meet your, the outcome goals that you have, safety, you need to think more holistically and broadly about too, and have an open, honest conversation about it, and be armed with the data, having done the work up front to understand what are the safety implications of this shift, whether it's students getting on a different vehicle type, walking a little bit further, or walking to school altogether. Really having those answers, being ready with an operating theory about the pedestrian safety of your neighborhood. And if you don't have that infrastructure, being that maybe that's not the right solution for that particular school or context, but being able to be targeted about it. And one of the things that we did with Indianapolis was just go back and redraw the hazard boundaries within their transportation system with a recognition that some of those ought not to apply, whereas there are new boundaries and new barriers have cropped up since the last time that map had been updated, but coming up with a process for exceptions for families that want to cite, neighborhood safety concerns. But then the conversation, like, you said, Superintendent Johnson, about, they used to walk and wait at a yellow bus stop. Now they're walking and waiting at a transit stop. It may be actually a shorter walk to the transit stop. And one point that's important for people to understand is if you miss the yellow bus, you may be stranded there, but the benefit of transit is if you miss that bus, there may be another one that comes 10 minutes right after. So that's an important safety benefit. So you just have to kind of be armed with these talking points but think more holistically about what is safety. When we say safety on one mode versus another, let's think about all the dimensions of what keeps our kids safe.
And Carl, Superintendent Johnson, you're talking about this in terms of the district's deep work on the safety question. How have your transit partners been on this, on the public transit side? What's the conversation been like on that end? Are they designed for these types of conversations? Do they identify a point person for you to work with? How has that looked? How has that looked on the public? What does that look like on the public transit side? And anything that comes to mind in terms of effective practices there in engaging, your public transit, authority in these types of conversations?
I can say from my experience, and then I'll defer to you, Dr. Superintendent Johnson, that what I've found is that often because of FTA requirements and because they're accountable to the general public, they often have, these transit authorities, the MBTA is one, and I've seen, evidence of this with Indigo. They have, very robust community engagement. They have to be very thoughtful and meticulous about safety, serving the general public. And again, they have other dimensions of safety that we don't often think about on yellow bus, just because it just hasn't been part of the conversation, like lighting and cameras and frequency and, the transit police. And there's other features and characteristics of transit buses, safety for someone loading and unloading, that the vehicles can lower down so that it's less of a step up. There's all kinds of other features of transit buses that they are, happy and ready to talk about and have that infrastructure. And so I found those conversations to be really rich. And then in particular around COVID, they again had to be very accountable to the public, right? More so than school districts are on this point, because this is their core business, right? With respect to the cleaning protocols and the social distancing and the mask wearing and the signage, very professional. And I think, as consuming that as now a parent of a soon-to-be kindergartner who may get on a yellow bus, right? You do think about all these different dimensions of safety, and it's important for folks to understand that the transit bus in some cases and some of these dimensions may be safer than a yellow bus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just ditto everything Carl shared in that regard. We've had a great partner in Indigo. Specifically, we're very fortunate. The CEO of our system was in a different city that whose school district moved their students over during her tenure there. So she was able to speak really comfortably in detail about these are the things we had to watch out for. These are the adjustments we had to make. And it wasn't a scary sort of proposition for her because she'd been through it before.
That's great. I'm going to move us to the kind of the perennial issue of driver shortages. This is something that has come up pre-COVID and I think continues to persist in a tight labor market just generally, whether it's substitute teachers or bus drivers or whatever we might be solving for. Can folks address and Carl, maybe get us rolling on this? What are approaches on this? How do we think about this? And what are sort of the things on your mind in terms of opportunities here?
Yeah, we just finished a learning network with a number of districts down in Houston, Texas, and it was around COVID challenges. And I can say whether we were talking about, cleaning or we were talking about scheduling or efficiencies or technology or anything else, one of the core threads that wove through the entire group and the challenges that districts were facing was this idea of driver shortage, right? So whether you're thinking about how to reduce your fixed costs and, reduce kind of the burden of that yellow bus network, or you're talking about alternative supply, it's all a way of attacking this reliance on a single mode, on a CDL bus driver. So where can you get students to school and support them in a different way, right? Where can you where can you actually also then affect the pipeline of CDL bus drivers? So you're kind of attacking it on all fronts, using less of them, finding more of them, right? And then finding other ways just to get the job done is all part of the effort. And so the driver shortage, I think, has always been something that vendors, contractors, and districts have faced, a challenge recruiting bus drivers. It's a hard gig. It's a split shift. It's often part-time. These are the major kinds of factors, but also, from a recruiting standpoint, there's an opportunity to recast the narrative and talk to a different kind of potential driver and support them through the process. Drivers that may, maybe have never previously thought about driving, but how can you connect them to the education ecosystem? How can you connect them to a mission? How can you show them pathways within a district, within an organization, where they could go from being a bus driver to a special education professional, or other part of district operations? That's kind of also an important part of what districts need to start doing, thinking more holistically and intentionally about recruiting and about supporting that workforce, or job matching, where we can find, if it's a part-time gig, you can find other roles for folks in the building. So again, thoughtful approach that takes analysis and an understanding of your context, but a recognition that with other options for drivers, driving for Amazon and Uber and Lyft and other flexible kinds of services that might have less COVID risk, it might also be less of a bear to manage than a bunch of students in a bus. And, it's important that wages are competitive and the offering is competitive, and that districts have a more resilient, diverse set of supply options, that they're not so reliant on the CDL yellow bus driver.
Yep, again, echo all of that. I think one of the things, because we fully outsourced our transportation to a different provider officially this year, so that was interesting, being in year one with COVID. But that's been something, even as we've done that outsourcing, that we've talked with that partner about, is how do we ensure drivers still feel connected to the district, like a part of Team IPS, everything from appreciation notes and cards that we're sending, that students are providing, but that mission orientation matters deeply. Like, it matters that you're at work every day helping to get our kids to school. And so how do we as a district, even though you're not our employee formally anymore, still cultivate this idea of partnership and mission alignment and the value of the work that they do every day?
I would say, and stop consolidation and efficiencies, right? Shortening routes, making them more rationalizing service levels so that you can better pair routes and drivers can have a more full-time proposition in their day, a full-time gig. These are all things that drivers want and need, and do support drivers and that make their job easier.
Yep, really interesting stuff there, including some of the workforce, being a part of the ecosystem, some of the workforce opportunities, maybe even some entrepreneurship opportunities, it sounds like, as well, as it relates to some of the things you're both talking about. Kind of as we're headed to the tail end of the conversation, would love you all to kind of react to this kind of last question. What should schools and networks be asking or thinking about that they aren't currently? And particularly, I know we have a mix of participants, some in traditional districts, some in schools that might be on the path to opening new high quality charter schools, or whatever the case might be. Would love to get your thoughts on what should schools and networks be thinking about, and particularly if folks have thoughts for those that might be just beginning to launch a school or earlier in their trajectory, particularly what might be things that they should be considering as well, as you react to that. And maybe Dave, you can kick us off on what schools and networks should be thinking about, just more generally on the transportation front.
Sure. I think I'll start to sound like a broken record after a while, but I think the things folks should be thinking about in transportation are exactly the same as they should be thinking about in everything else they're doing in delivering education. So first, again, think about your user, engage them in the design of what you're doing for them. If you're starting a new organization, a new charter, a new school, you have a unique opportunity to do this without any of the sort of inertia of what was done historically. And then make sure you're contemplating how you're going to collect evidence of effectiveness as you do this. And so that's also, I think sometimes folks miss this, but that's also a user-centered exercise. Who are your stakeholders? What do they care about? And how do you measure how well you're doing on the thing your stakeholders care about? So,
Dave, what would be an example of kind of evidence you'd want to collect on the transportation front? Maybe give folks a little bit of texture on that for a sec.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Raj. So I think, let's say you learn from families that the most important thing to them is not how long their student is on the bus, but how reliable their bus route is. Make sure you're capturing data on the reliability of the bus route, right? What is the outcome measure you're using? How are you capturing that? And what are your targets? What are you shooting for when you're trying to do that? And then when you're engaging folks like Formative, you can work with them on this, but you can also measure them against it. Anytime you're hiring a contractor, you should be thinking, how are they doing on the outcomes that we have charged them with supporting us in? If folks care about safety, right? How are you measuring the safety of students getting to and from your school buildings? So engage folks in what they care about, figure out what the outcomes are, and then come up with ways to measure those outcomes so that you know if you're doing well or not, and you can iterate based on that.
Awesome. Superintendent Johnson, thoughts for schools, networks, as they embark on some of these challenges? Welcome your thoughts and reflections here.
Yeah, I'll just share maybe two things. The first is, schools, districts have a bajillion things coming at them right now from all spaces, areas, all directions. So I think the first is sort of to get clear on what it is you want to accomplish. Obviously, we know accelerating student learning, addressing unfinished learning, all of those things are what most of us are sort of totally zeroed in on right now. Don't discount the role that your operations, things like transportation, play in giving you the enabling conditions to actually execute on that thing. So I would say don't be so narrow in scope that you lose sight of those enabling conditions that allow that acceleration of student learning or a deeper and richer learning experience for students. There's a lot of levers to pull on in the transportation space, specifically that you could address. The second thing I will say is, we got a lot of capacity from partnering with Formative. Carl is not paying me to say this, but it gave us a lot of capacity that we ourselves didn't have. It allowed me to sort of free my brain up for thinking about some of those like super weedy things that certainly are out of my depth range and even our transportation team's range, so that we could focus in on the strategy part of the conversation, but have a partner who was there to, one, ask us great questions to prompt some of that thinking, but then two, do some of the legwork for us as well. And so I also think if this is something that you are exploring and want to do, like make sure you have a partner who gives you the brain space to think about strategy and ask you the right questions, and that it can help support your capacity to actually then execute well.
Awesome. Great thoughts. Carl, over to you. Your thoughts and bring us home here.
Yeah, what I'd like to add to that, I appreciate all those points Dave and Superintendent Johnson made. I think, taking stock is an important first step to understanding where you're at, understanding the, context and kind of current efficiencies and barriers and policy context and boundary context and service levels, of your system is super important. And then understanding and not feeling limited by how things have always been done or the kind of perceived constraints that you've always had. But feel free to, brainstorm about the outcomes you want to generate and the kind of system you want to create, and then have an honest conversation about those trade-offs. Well, okay, if we want to provide this flexibility, we have to run our system this way. What does that mean in terms of a conversation with families? What do we need to ask of families, but then what are they getting out of it? And so don't be shackled by just how things have always been done. That if you give me a lever long enough, I can move the earth. If you calibrate service levels and boundaries far enough, you can have perfect efficiency and fully loaded buses and maximize use of your assets. And then you can free up a lot of dollars to do a lot of new exciting stuff. The last point is just, I think, really thoughtfully integrate transportation into your long-term planning. How you think about enrollment, how you think about where you're going. One of the transit urban planning adages is that